Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. I'd like to thank everybody that's commented so far on YouTube and on Facebook on the RPG Brigade Facebook page, where I linked my video that I did, I guess yesterday, on disturbing themes in role-playing games and in fiction. So those comments and some discussions I've had with other people, some things I've read, thoughts I've had, have me going in a few different directions on what I want to talk about in terms of this dialogue. But I'm only going to go in one direction today, mercifully, and save the other ones for other videos so we can kind of stay on track, or I can stay on track. So today I really want to talk about the way that these disturbing elements are presented, and we'll stick to role-playing games. Now, I want to make it clear too that I'm not just talking about things like cosmic horror and Lovecraftian type stuff. There's a lot of things that can be disturbing, and I'll go into some detail in another video about some of those other disturbing elements. I'll cover some of them here. And it's also, I'm not talking about going into gory detail. I know a lot of people talked about that, and that's part of it. But to me, it doesn't have to be, all gore and gruesome stuff where we end up becoming polluted and tattooing our necks and all that kind of junk. There's a lot of things that are disturbing. And, I've had this experience many times in my life, and I wonder if you have as well, where you know what you're thinking. You have this idea in your head. You know how you just have a trouble expressing it. You know what you mean. But then one day you hear somebody say something, or you read something in print, and you go, "That's exactly what I was talking about." And so I've had that happen a couple times recently, where I was like, "Aha, that's what I meant." And it's a couple things. There's a channel called Emergent Play, and he covered a few things, which I guess I'm late to the party in knowing these terms, but I watched that recently. I'll link that channel down below. But also some other stuff that was in this game, Circle of Hands, which can be rather disturbing. And in this, Ron Edwards has this really brilliant concept, where he talks about separating what's going on in the game in terms of what's being presented, and he talks about the thing called a backdrop, and then actual situations and scenes. And I'm not going to talk about situations and scenes so much, except to, that's what's actually happening. That's what's going on in gameplay. That's what's happening to your characters, what they're experiencing personally, etc. The backdrop, on the other hand, is what's known to be going on in the world. Now, in this particular game, it's really gritty. It's the world is very tribal and clans kind of rule the place. It's a world of might makes right. There is no centralized government. There is no Geneva Convention. People get into conflicts, and they are not nice. And so all the atrocities that you can think of that happen when one group conquers another, well, that's what happens. I don't need to go into detail. You can list them all in your head. It's disturbing. It's part of the backdrop. It doesn't need to be part of the game. These things are, understood that they're there, but they don't need to be discussed in graphic detail. They don't need to be discussed at all, except in passing, or to say that the usual wartime atrocities have occurred. When people are executed, it's often slow, and there's many different ways to do that, etc. Once again, you get the idea, but it doesn't have to be explicitly described. It's part of the backdrop. And so that's a big difference. I also talked, he also mentioned in here, let me see if I get her name right, Meg Baker had a couple different ways that disturbing elements are handled in fiction and role-playing games and whatever, but in fiction. And one's called No One Gets Hurt. And the idea is, and I'm probably misquoting a little bit here, is that if there's things that you find disturbing, that they just don't happen. Because you're not going to, if it's triggering for you, then you kind of raise your hand before this happens, and we're just not going to include this at all in the fiction. The other one is I Will Not Abandon You, which is a little bit more dangerous, but also potentially a little bit more rewarding, or a lot more rewarding. The idea that, we're going to respect each other's boundaries, and they may come up, and one of us may have to raise our hands and say, well, hey, we can't describe this in detail, or this just, I'm not comfortable going there, and everybody else doesn't abandon them and respects that. Helps each other through these disturbing moments when they occur. And Ron actually also talks about lines and veils, which kind of corresponds to this. The idea that we set lines and veils in this experience, and the lines would be like literally we talk about this is not going to happen in this game. Either this doesn't happen to my character, doesn't come up in discussion, etc. There's lines that we will not cross. But veils, more interesting. The idea, once again, it's understood that these things are happening, but we don't discuss them in explicit detail. And I can think of a example from my own gaming history where I had a character who was not very nice, And when we captured prisoners, every once in a while he would torture them. It was understood that he would torture them. But we didn't discuss this in explicit detail. I didn't go into how he was doing that. It was just understood that's what he was doing. It wasn't because I got my jollies doing that. That's what that character was like. But there was a veil, and I never really felt the need to pull the veil off. And I believe one time I discussed with another player, and they preferred I didn't, in the first place. But we had that discussion, so it was understood. It wasn't for the person me being sick. It was that's what that character was like. So, we used a veil in that case. Emergent Play also talked about some really cool concepts. The ideas of framing and bleed. And the idea of framing is literally, and what it sounds like, it's a frame around your character, a line between or a wall between you and the character, so that which does not it can be as blurry or sharp as you want it to be, which separates you from the actual character you're playing. But sometimes there's bleed, where you and the character, the line's gonna get distinct or indistinct emotionally. Sometimes you have what's called bleed in, where you're having a bad day. Oversimplifying. Well, your character's having a bad day too. You're ticked off, they're ticked off. But more interesting is when your character becomes upset. When your character encounters disturbing things, when they become uncomfortable, you become uncomfortable. You start to feel that bleed out. Interesting concept. And so you have to experiment for yourself, like how strong you want that frame. But it protects you. So these just some these are concepts that I understood. Look, I'm dropping money. Concepts I understood, but didn't have words for. Another thing, this game too, I don't want to make the video too long, broken rooms, that can be very disturbing in a different way. And a part of it is, once again, there's things that are happening, and the book goes into some detail about what happens, and there's worlds where literally there's been a major catastrophe. It's post-apocalyptic. There's been, a major disaster on the world, on Earth. Asteroids hit the Earth. Most people are dead. All the things that you would imagine are happening at that point when society is broken down, they're happening. When people are fighting for their lives and struggling, you can be as explicit or as veiled as you want to be when you discuss this. But it's understood. It's part of the backdrop. It's part of the mood of that game in that particular parallel reality. It's dark. It can be very disturbing. There are other realities in there that are equally disturbing for different reasons. You don't necessarily have to go into all the detail, but they're there. That's in the back of your head. And what's probably even more disturbing is the idea in something like Circle of Hands, as you walk by these atrocities, your character may be just used to them and perhaps a little jaded. And maybe they walk by some particularly horrific things, but they're on their way to do something more important. Or maybe they do decide, maybe there is some bleed, and you decide you need to do something about that. But just because you don't talk about them in great detail doesn't mean things aren't disturbing in the game, and doesn't mean they're not present. We don't have to be ridiculous and describe everything like crazed teenagers trying to outdo each other and shock each other for it to have real emotional impact. So I'd like to hear your experience. What is your perspective on this? What have your experiences been? What are your thoughts? Talk to you later.